Very nice. That was awesome. So, yeah, where is it you find your connection? Where is that deeper well that we draw from? When I listen to all the lyrics of that song, I think about the teacher, the preacher in the Ecclesiastes verse. All is vanity, vanity of vanities. We spend our life. Is this what it's all about, basically? What was that song? What's it all about? Alfie? Is it basically, this is it. Just the strife, all the striving, and then we get old, and then it's over. And then yet there's something else, water from a deeper well. That's what I think this verse is about, and when I think about what it is that's the most important thing in life, I think that's what I'm drawn back to. What is the most important thing in life? And I was thinking about that, and I was traveling. If some of y'all read the blog this past week, I'm not even going to ask a show of hands. I've already humiliated myself several times now. But if you read it by any chance, it was really it was an accidental thing completely, because I wasn't gonna write one because I traveled this week. I left immediately after worship last week. Linda, my wife, is on a renewal leave. The ministers here get renewal leave every 5 to 7 years, something like that, and get about 5 or 6 weeks of actual renewal leave. And that's pretty much true across the conference. Me being new back in this thing, I'll probably retire before I ever get my renewal leave at this point. But she's out there, and so we decided to take some time, and so we met in Taos. She's in Colorado, and we met in Taos, and had this wonderful sort of encounter. We love going to bed and breakfast. We love meeting people. That's one reason why we like bed and breakfast, and others because it just feels more intimate. It feels more present because you're in someone's home. Even if it's now a commercial residential kind of place, it's still a home. It still has that feel. There's mystery all around it. There's, in this particular house, which was Adobe style, and it was sort of a Pueblo style, with like rooms on top of rooms and hidden rooms with spiral staircases. You didn't even realize it. It looked like it would house maybe 3 couples. And we found out the next morning there were 8 couples that were staying in this place, and it still had 5 other rooms that weren't inhabited that day. And it was like, where are these rooms? But you just kind of go here and there, and these little cubbies lead to another spiral staircase. There was a hot tub on the very tippy top of the 4th floor that just sat out there. They thought, well, we got space. We put a hot tub out here. And so it was just this amazing place. But we sat down, and there was this couple that we'd met, just said hello to before they went up their staircase the day before. They were from Canada, and we went to our room at the back of the house, and just thought it was interesting. They were a little bit younger than us, but from Canada. Well, people travel from all around to Taos. So the next morning we sat down, and they said, can we join you? And we sat down with them, and they sat down, and we just had a nice visit. Now, as I said in the blog, and I've said this in here before too, Linda and I don't often introduce ourselves by saying, yes, I'm Reverend Tom McDermott, and this is Reverend Linda McDermott, because the next thing that happens almost invariably is, oh my God, I'm so glad that God placed you here in my presence. You don't know what's been going on in my life. And then it's just kind of just happens. And it's not like we're not really happy to do that. I mean, but we're not. We're really not. I mean, we're on vacation. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. But in reality, I mean, partly it's not because we don't want to be present to other people. Of course we do. That's why we're not just in this ministry, but why we're just in the midst of life in the way that we are. It's because we want to be present. I want to know your story, because if I listen close enough to your story, I'm going to hear my own. And that's what I'm looking for, is that connection. So we like that. The problem is when we say we're ministers, it creates this whole static sort of reality, and we're placed on some other kind of label and some pedestal or some label or some identity, and then there's no relationship anymore. It's all about the stereotype. It's all about the masks. And even the people responding to us have also put on the mask, so there's nothing authentic at that point. So we keep quiet as much as we can, which is really hard when people say, well, then what do you do? Which is what they said to us. And we said, well, we teach, and we speak places, and do things like that. We help people. We try to get involved and help out. And we were just being as vague and general, and they're like, okay, so do you work? I mean, they kept kind of saying, and we was like, well, yeah, and then Linda's laughing and going like, I try not to as much as possible. And so we're sort of dodging the whole thing. And it's like, well, what do you do? Because we heard they'd been in Albuquerque. Now, they're from Vancouver. And as I'm thinking, why would anybody leave Vancouver to go anywhere, right? If you've ever been to Vancouver, it's absolutely beautiful. You know, and so I said, well, why did you go to, what were y'all doing? And they said similar kinds of things. They were like, well, we were there studying, and we were kind of at a workshop, and I'm thinking, okay, like a business thing maybe, kind of a business workshop. And so we went that direction, and then this guy who introduced himself as Dave said, yeah, I speak around a little bit, I do some consulting, and so we went there to kind of study. And it just kept going this direction where we're sort of dodging and dancing until finally they said, well, we were with this guy named Richard Rohr. And then Linda and I are like, oh, well, we know Richard Rohr. We've worked with him. He has the Center for Contemplation and Action, Spirituality and Contemplation, and Center for Action, and I'm getting it all wrong, but it has all of those words in it. And he's a Franciscan monk who's been deeply involved in spirituality and activism, spiritual activism, for years. And Lynn Deloney, who I'm not sure where Lynn is right now. Back in the back, on the floor, in the back, just where you would expect a monk to be. Yes, exactly. Lynn back in the back, meditating and holding this place together. A big fan and follower, and studied with Richard Rohr as well over the years. And this couple was down there in Albuquerque doing this 3-year intern program for spirituality. And so now I'm thinking, okay, what kind of business? And then I'm thinking maybe we don't want to talk because maybe they are in fact involved in ministry somewhere, and then maybe that's going to lead somewhere we weren't sure where to go. And little by little, the discussion naturally found a place of meeting, sort of like Rumi's song that we just sang, out beyond ideas. It sort of found a place of meeting because we were simply listening to each other, just paying attention. And as we listened, we discovered that this whole point of passion was a couple of things. Number one, Dave, he started talking about how important stories are. And Linda looked at me, and I was like, don't go there, don't say anything. And I just was going like, yes, they are. I love stories. I like stories. I think stories. And so I'm sharing just some ideas and insights about how we connect to one another's stories, and that how sometimes the most powerful way of speaking is by kind of listening to your audience, and then I slipped out the word congregation, and then I quickly went back to our groups of business people when you're working with them. And I said, it's in that listening that sometimes we discover the words we are supposed to speak. And then she was kind of chimed in and said, in the way that sort of the Spirit moves in the midst of that. And we're going like, yeah, sort of like that. And so it's just one thing after another that we start opening up and discovering. And she had then said, Kathy then said, yeah, I mostly share my story of my work and what I've done, but I'm very shy about speaking. So we talked a little bit about overcoming speaking shyness and the fear of speaking in presence. And she says, well, when I just tell my story, and I said, and it's when that story's authentic, when you really aren't worried about what it is you're trying to accomplish, but more what it is you're already present to. And all of a sudden we're all lighting up, and they looked at us and they said, come on, what do you really do? And I said, well, and then we kind of opened up and laughed and said, we're both Methodist ministers, but we hesitate because of people's definitions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're going like, well, we kind of figured that you're not like that, but we weren't sure what it was you were doing. And I'm like, well, yeah. And I said, so you're speaking? And she says, well, yeah. I won the Olympic gold in 1978 for giant slalom at Innsbruck. So I'm a gold medalist, and I travel around, and now I'm one of the skiers in world championships, but I do water skiing competitions, and I'm like in the top 5, she said. But it's not like I really try to, that's what's not important to me. And she didn't, and I didn't even know who Dave Phillips was. He's like number 4 in the world in terms of competition skiing. And so this sort of just spills out as we're at the table. And what was fascinating at one point was that Dave started talking about what happened by virtue of just our practice rather than our intention. Well, partly our intention, but it was really our practicing, just our being present. What started to happen was, instead of starting here at opposites from our definitions of who each other was, gold medalist, oh my gosh, I can't relate to these people. They're so disciplined, they're so rigid, they're so ambitious, and I'm so present and want to just be, and then and then we're clergy, on top of that. So if we had started there, imagine where the conversation would have stopped. But instead, the conversation went without labels, and it spoke to where we are as people and what we value, what we are driven by. What moves us. And most of that had to do with connection and authenticity. And so Dave looked over and says, well, you know, Richard Rohr talks about this. And I said, yeah, I kind of remember. But then he reminded me of this whole idea of this triangle that we often think of. There's two ways to come at a subject. And we've talked about that as I've addressed questions in here. And we talked about the sort of, that if we define an answer, obviously, that we're not going to define everyone's answer, right? We're going to define our answer as opposed to your answer, etc. And he said, there's more than just two ways. He said, there's a third way. And so he sort of visually created this triangle. And he said, it's what happened here. Neither of us was really interested in how we define each other. But instead, he kind of raised his hand up and he said there was something else we were looking at, something higher, something more central, something more grounded, whatever. He said, but the more we drew towards that, he says it's as we lift that up, then the two at the bottom just come together. It just draws it together. And we discover what we have in common and what drives us in common as opposed to what is our differences. And that's when they started kind of spilling the beans on all the other stuff that they had done. It was a fascinating, accidental encounter, if you call them that. I often tell people, they say, well, that was another God moment. And I say, no, they're all God moments. I mean, we live and move and have our being in the presence of creation, of Creator. And so all we're doing is being present and discovering how we're all connected and what we have in common first. Now, as I read more about her, and I went home, after we got in the car and we got up to Colorado, after that, I got online because I was curious. I didn't know. She didn't say anything other than she was a gold medalist. And it was back in the 70s. I didn't know anything. She didn't even tell me her last name. She said Kathy, and he said Dave. And that they were both from Canada, and that they were both skiers on the ski team for a long time, and then got off of that, and then that they were now skiing competitively. That's all they said. So I looked it up and found out all the stats, and found out who she was, and then found out her orientation. And the reality is that if we sat down and talked about our creeds, or our orthodox, or our doctrine, we would have been surprised at how different we are. Isn't that interesting? Because she came from a very evangelical background in Canada. And while that's changing for her as she explores a wider, more unified sort of way of looking at the world, that's her background. Now, we have common roots in that reality, but that's still where she is. If we had started at that point, we never would have gotten to that place of connection. And that's the challenge for us. And I think that's what's at the heart of the text. As we were reading this text this morning. And of course, I told all that story and didn't even bother to look at my notes. So I want to make a couple of quick points with this. I think the challenge for us, when I was reading Richard Rohr's books called Falling Upward, which is a great book if you haven't read that book. Did I get that title right, Lynn? I thought I did. I was just skimming through it because I realized after talking to this couple, I needed to go back and look at some of the things they were talking about, which he brings up in that particular book. And he talks about the second half of life, which is interesting. A lot of us are in that second half of life. But what's interesting is he says the issues at the second half of life are not that different from the issues in the first half of life. They're really the same ones. The challenge is, and/or the gift is, that we've either figured it out by the second half of life and are no longer driven by the ego or driven by the needs to sort of how we dress ourselves up, how we worry about our careers, how we strive to do this or that, how we try to make our mark or make our identity or think we have to be such and such. Then once we get to a certain point in life, we start going like, yeah, it's not so important. What's really become important to us? And while the biological needs are always important, basic survival, house, clothing, food, all of that stuff is always important. All of the ways in which we've sort of mirrored that we have to live this out. The ways in which culture has sort of mirrored for us that it needs to look a certain way or that has to be a certain way or that we have to have a certain status or consumption or materialist sort of reality. All of that we sort of move beyond as we've gotten older. And if we do it successfully in our first half, we realize that what we've always been looking for, and we've talked about it in here before, is connection. We realize what we've always been looking for is not to make our mark. That's the shadow. That's the opposite side of what ego really longs for. We mask it by thinking we've got to make it something, and therefore we have value and worth. But Real, authentic ego is simply, I am me. How can we find our connection in the midst of creation? When we get past of ego's shadow and celebrate what ego has, our authentic self, who we are at our core, what really drives us deep within, that's when we find that authentic connection with others, that sense of belonging. I was reading this book called The View from Lazy Point by Carl Safina, and it's this book about sort of where we are in ecology, where our world is and where things are going. And in it, he asked this question: if we look at the world around us and we think, okay, we've spent most of our life kind of trying to achieve, trying to accomplish, trying to create, and in the process not really paying attention to what might be happening to the ecology around us, for example. He says we stop sometimes to ask ourselves, as human beings always, what is the meaning of life? And he said that's probably not the way to ask the question, but that's the way that ego keeps asking it. What is the meaning of life? I'm worried about this. I want this. I feel like I'm not this yet. I need to be this. Ego's asking all those questions. The question is not, what is the meaning of life? And if you're reading the gospel in 633, chapter 6, verse 33, you realize that's not what it's about. The question is, where is the meaning of life? The question is not what, but where, because it's everywhere. And the longer we avoid paying attention to it, the more we continue to strive for basically what is our shadow side that Carl Jung would call just that side of us that's not really facing authentic self, not really dealing with it. And he says that where the relationship, where the meaning of life is that it is in between, which I love because I'm a big Martin Buber fan, and Martin Buber's whole philosophy and theology is centered around this idea that where we meet God is when we meet in encounter, when we meet in authentic relationship, open to one another, listening and being present, and essentially being what Jesus called the greatest commandment, to love one another as we love ourselves. That sense of presence creates meaning. That sense of relationship creates context and meaning. And it's possible to have that both with relationships with people, but more so even with our own creation in which we live. And I wonder if we think about this kind of question, it's been around for forever, right? 10,000 years ago, they discovered the new Homo. Anybody remember how to pronounce it? Naledi? Nobody's going to venture? The new Homo. Yeah. It's the new hominid, right? And they discovered that. And what was interesting was it leaves this big question like, okay, is there another branch of sort of the human precursor to what we have now? But I was thinking in terms of this question, right? Our question was always biologically. It was always survival-oriented. And here's the interesting thing. As we've gotten older, we've changed, right? No, we haven't. We're smarter, but we're still operating out of primeval brain. We still have that ancient brain in us. We are still driven by fear. We are still driven by flight. We are still driven by these kinds of ego issues. We've just decorated them differently, but we're still operating out of this ancient mindset. And it's dangerous, because it's like being a whole bunch of really smart, dangerous creatures. Because now we can create all this stuff, but we're still operating out of the primitive mind. And until we can get past all of that and begin to find meaning deeply in what we do, and in how we encounter one another, including creation, then what we are doing is simply destroying ourselves. And that sounds a little drastic, I think. But I wonder sometimes if it's not just a little bit true. That what we are really called to be is to be more human. That what it means to seek the kingdom of God may actually mean, how can we be more human? So I want to make a suggestion before we wrap things up here. As we think about what it is that's really important in life, I think we'd all pretty much agree on that ultimately we long to be connected. Whether or not just connected to one another, but connected, valued, having a sense of belonging with someone and with ourselves. And I think in some of us, if we've experienced that, one place where we've experienced that is somebody who's practiced this whole idea of seeking the kingdom in what Richard Rohr calls mirroring. If you've been a part of the whole entrepreneurial movement over the last decade or two, you've gone to a mentor. You've worked with a mentor. But what's been mirrored is what our culture is about. Achievement, success, accomplishment, the next thing. Kathy talked about it at the table when she talked about winning the Olympic. Except she said it was interesting. Right before the competition, I suddenly let go of all that because I thought, what am I doing here? She literally didn't just simply, she didn't doubt her ability. She said, I'm not sure this matters that much. And so she literally sat down, she said, I prayed, and I just said, you know what, I'm just going to say it doesn't matter. I'm just going to do what I love to do. And I'm going to really have fun. And that's what she did. And she says, I was shocked more than anybody that I won. She said, especially the girl who had been the champion for the last 3 years in that competition, she was shocked that I won. And she said, to this day, I still say it had nothing to do with my sense of I had to accomplish that. It had to do with my sudden sense of saying I just have to be what I think I'm called to be and love what I'm doing. And if I'm connected to that, then it's whatever it is. What is it that gets mirrored for you? Who is it that mirrors not just what ego says, what culture is constantly stressing, but what mirrors your worth, your sense of value, who literally loves you into being? That's what I think it means to connect to the kingdom of God, is to love one another into this sense of redemption and being, that we know we are part of something amazing, that we know we're part of this astounding creation, and we mirror that back and forth to one another. That's what I think Jesus says, stop worrying about everything else, just be that. Amen.